MarkRogersTV, of course, talking college football. And if you've joined me over the last few weeks, I have started and concluded a series in which I have restructured college football. A lot of the conference structure currently doesn't make sense. The scheduling could be better in the playoff system as well. But mostly I wanted to focus on the structure of the conferences. So I have formed a 6-conference system in major college football. And my focus here was to bring every program into a conference, number one, to also make up conferences that make sense geographically. And to an even greater extent, as I got into it, I intensified the geographic rivalries within divisions within conferences. I established size consistency at 12 per conference, also reunited some conference rivals from way back in yesteryear, maintained other non-conference rivalries through the scheduling system I built, and all the conference championship games are intact as well. So let me brush through this, and if you want clarification on the system, go back to my introductory video, and then I knocked out a conference video pertaining to the structure of each league. So let's start out west with the Pac-12. Not a whole lot of shakeup here. The Pac-12 stays with 12 teams. We lose Colorado as they go to the Big 12, and we gain Boise State in the Pac-12. All right, as we go to the SEC, not a whole lot of shakeup there. We turn the clock back to 1991. We've got a 12-team SEC losing Missouri and Texas A&M. In the Big 12, the Big 12 goes back to its name branding of 12 teams. And as we just mentioned, Colorado will join the Big 12 along with Missouri and Texas A&M. West Virginia is lost out of the Big 12 as they move on to another league to be announced. The Big 10 has a bit of a shakeup. Penn State has been a great addition to the conference, but Penn State will no longer be a player in the Big 10. Maryland and Rutgers, 2 new additions and marginal additions at best, are no longer in the Big 10, but the Big 10 adds Notre Dame. That makes total sense in regards to geography and rivalries. Okay, there's also an additional conference when we look at the northeastern part of the country, where there used to be a whole lot of rivalries involving West Virginia, Penn State, Pitt, Syracuse, and Boston College. All those schools are reunited, so we have a Big East Conference of 12 teams, a North Division that contains Penn State, BC, Syracuse, Pitt, Connecticut, and Temple. The Southern Division of the Big East Conference, West Virginia, Maryland, Rutgers, Louisville, Army, and Navy. So before we move on to the scheduling aspect, Mike, I'll bring you in. Mike LaValle from Last Word on College Football to review this and let me know what do you think.
Mark, thanks for having me. Always great to join you. I think the first thing I would say is I think this is what you and I would do if we had our choice to restructure college football. I certainly don't think this is the way college football is headed. You've seen my pieces before. You think that I think college football is headed to fewer conferences, probably a 4-by-16 structure. But like you, this is what I would do. If I were in charge of college football for a day, I'd make a few more conferences, make them smaller, and make it more regional. So I like what you've done here. And so I try to do the same thing you did here. And here's the differences I saw. I'd push back a little bit on a couple things. First off, we have 4 team differences in who we would put in this Power 5 structure. You have Central Florida, South Florida, Connecticut, and Temple. I left those 4 teams out. In their place, I have BYU, Houston, Colorado State, and Air Force. Just as a point of difference, I think your structure is a little bit too focused on the East. I would like to balance it out. I think there's some quality football out West. I just don't think we watch it enough. So I had those 4 teams, all 4 of which are really out West. Maybe Houston's not considered West, but they're all 4 certainly West of the 4 teams you have. The other thing with those 4 teams is I think if you take Central Florida and South Florida out, that kind of imbalances the G5 conferences. It's important to note with a 6-by-12 structure, you have 72 FBS teams, so you're reducing the G5 teams to 56. So I think it's important to consider the effect you'll have on the G5 structure and conferences as well. So that's the first pushback I would give you is I would add BYU, Houston, Colorado State, and Air Force. The second thing is I don't have a Big East. I have what I call the Continental Conference. And so my conferences are generally aligned, similar to yours, except for the Big East. So essentially, I have two 6-team divisions that fall outside of the current 5-conference structure. So I group those two divisions together in what I call the Continental Conference. Out west, you have BYU, Boise State, Air Force, Colorado State, Houston, and then Minnesota. Minnesota is probably the big loser in my restructure. I moved them out of the Big Ten. I know there's a lot of history there. But it's kind of older history. There's not there is a rivalry there, but Minnesota hasn't been a player. They're the most north and west team in the Big Ten. I think they just fit. That's the one team. It was really either Minnesota or Notre Dame, or moving Iowa State there and then moving maybe Iowa into the Big 12, which I think Iowa and Notre Dame are much more natural fits in the Big Ten. So that's why I pushed Minnesota into the Continental Conference West. Out east, I have Louisville, Boston College, Rutgers, Syracuse, Army, and Navy as my 6-team Continental Conference East. So specific teams and conferences in the Big Ten, you put out Penn State. I like having Penn State and Pitt in the Big Ten East. And then I put Notre Dame in the Big Ten West, and really the rest of the Big Ten kind of looks like it looks now. Penn State, Pitt, I think, is a good addition to the East, and Notre Dame in the West. That's geographically aligned. It fits. I think it fits very well. We were really the same on the SEC. No changes there. I mean, I think the SEC is kind of historically fits that 12-team mold. The ACC, you have those 2 Florida teams. I did not do that, so I didn't have those 2 Florida teams. So I added West Virginia and Maryland. That's kind of the northeast portion. I also, instead of the coastal and what's the other?
The Atlantic.
Yes, instead of the coastal and Atlantic, and you know that confuses me every time I try to say that. I now have a North ACC and a South ACC. I'm a directional guy. I like North, South, East, and West. Legends and leaders. Coastal and Atlantic, that's not me. So I have a ACC North with West Virginia and Maryland instead of the two directional Florida schools that you had in the ACC. The Big 12, you had Missouri in the south of the Big 12. I would kind of push back on that. I actually moved Texas Tech to the north of the Big 12 and put Oklahoma and Oklahoma State into the south of the Big 12. Now, I could see restructuring that a little bit maybe, but it's important to keep those rivalries. And with Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, and Texas, you have to consider that. Plus, I moved Nebraska back into the Big 12, going back to those historical rivalries. I noticed you left Nebraska in the Big 10. So I think where you moved Colorado into the Big 12, I moved Nebraska back into the Big 12. Didn't really have room for both of those. Although with that Continental West, I do have some leeway. I might go back and reconsider moving Colorado into the Big 10, back into the Big 12, and maybe move somebody over to the Pac, or maybe somebody up to the Big 10. Maybe we leave Nebraska and move somebody from that Continental West back into the Pac. But right now I moved Nebraska back into the Big 12, where you moved Colorado back in. I would push a little bit on Houston into the Big 12. Kind of do they fit in Utah as well? So for the Pac, I think the only differences we have in the Pac are Boise, and again that stems from. I'm sorry, you have Colorado, you have Utah in the Pac-12. I'm sorry about that. And then you move Colorado out of the Pac and put Boise State in there, where I have Boise State, like I said, in the Continental Conference West. So I think that's really the biggest contentions for us is Minnesota and Nebraska, and the whole that 6 conference. I think that's where everybody's going to struggle, is how do you form that 6 conference and keep that 6x12 formation. I did it by kind of having a Continental Conference with an East and West division, kind of like a Conference USA concept, what they started out as, whereas you kind of went back to the old Big East. So I think both are good. I kind of like mine better, and those are the reasons why. So those are our major differences as far as structures and teams.
Mike, it always bothered me during the BCS era that there was a Big East automatic buy into the BCS Bowl Championship Series, when the Big East was clearly not on par with the other conferences. So when I built out the Big East, that was my hesitation, was that the conference wouldn't be nearly as strong as the other conferences. And that's one of the main reasons why I pulled out Louisville and Penn State to bolster that conference and try to make it as good as possible. You've got Pitt there, West Virginia, usually decent football teams as well. You make a great case, I believe, off camera when you mentioned Air Force needing to be in this structure. I've got Army and Navy playing in the Big East, and Air Force obviously playing, being that academy, and then also playing in the same level of football, if not better than Army and Navy on most occasions, could be part of that. I really wanted, the purpose of this was actually to get to the scheduling component for me as we kind of segue. So my perfect mark was to hit the 72 teams within the 12-team conferences, but I did not want to leave out BYU and Boise State in particular. I didn't feel real good about including Central Florida and South Florida in the ACC as well, knowing that they could be underlings in the ACC, and then leaving out BYU and especially Boise State, considering what they've accomplished over the last 10 to 15 years in college football in competing. What concerned me was going to a 9-game conference schedule that I wouldn't be able to devise one for a 13-team league, but I could. Then the issue became, okay, in scheduling, as we segue to that, my aim in scheduling, non-conference first, was to create an even schedule, meaning that you're not playing a parity type NFL type schedule where the best teams are playing the best teams, or certainly taking it out of the hands of the schools that go out and schedule their own games now. I would like to see a non-conference schedule that's equal, meaning teams are playing 2 Power 5 teams out of the 3 non-conference games that had a composite 500 record the year before. And I've certainly gone through that for a number of leagues, and it's certainly feasible. So, for example, if the SEC is to play the Big 12 and the Pac-12 next season under my system, then you match up 2 teams to play Alabama that have a composite 500 schedule from the previous season. Now, that's not completely feasible this year because it's the first year of my system, so you're working off of last year's conference alignments and records and the uneven 8 and 9 game schedule, but you can come extremely close. You can pretty much hit the mark about 90% of the time, but then going forward in year 2 and beyond, you can certainly accomplish a 500 composite record for the 2 Power 5 teams that everybody would play.
Yeah, Mark, I like the 12-game schedule. I would consider 11, but I think we're kind of with a 6x12 structure. I think we're kind of set with 12 games now. A couple things I would disagree with you on. I kind of like the 8-game conference schedule, and here's why. If we go to 2 6 divisions, you get your 5 interdivisions. You still get 3 of the 6 every year. Now, I prefer having the one-time permanent rival, so the SEC does that. Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, Auburn, Florida, LSU. The team from the other division you play every year, and then you get 2 rotations. So you play a home and away with every team in the other division every 5 years, 2 games every 5 years. If you want to, you can offset that so that a kid's never going to go through a full 4 years at a school and not get to play a certain team. So there's ways you can manage that. So I kind of like the 8-team. What that gives you room for is it gives you room for 2 games against Power 5 non-conference opponents. I love your idea of a challenge week. You take the SEC and you rotate it. So let's say you take the ACC, and in year 1 the ACC plays the Big 10, and the number 1 team from the ACC from the previous year plays the number 1 team from the Big 10 the previous year, so on down 1 through 12, so on and so forth. And you can even do it by division. Maybe ACC South plays the Big 10 East, and the other division plays the other division 1 through 6. And everybody in college football plays the challenge week on the same week, so it lines up nicely. But I don't think you can have 2 challenge weeks because you still have the rivalry. So if ACC is playing the Big 10 and the Pac-12 that year, then Georgia Tech and Georgia don't get to play. So I think 1 week is a challenge week instead of 2. You have 1 week that's a challenge week, and then 1 week which is a free week. So that's a team that's for the school to schedule. So let's say LSU can schedule whomever they want. It doesn't have to be out of any particular conference, and they don't have to be any particular rank. And it's up to the school to schedule that. And then so you have 2 other games. One I think is a mandatory group of 5 game, but the problem with that is going back to now we have 72 FBS teams, and we only have 56 G5 teams. So obviously those numbers don't match up. The G5, some of the G5 teams will have to. Luckily, they'll probably have six conferences with 9 teams, a few with 12. So some of those G5 teams will have to play 2 Power 5 teams in a year, and then you have another week, which is your free week. You can schedule either G5, FCS, or even another Power 5 if you want. I don't think any school is going to schedule 3 Power 5s. So you can schedule G5 for some of those G5 teams that don't get 2 games against Power 5, and some schools will still choose to play against FCS schools who are local in their area or the region, so that they can give them the experience and the financial benefit they need to keep those programs going. I think I'm one of the very few guys that's okay with Power 5 teams playing FCS teams. I really think that helps develop the quality of the programs and the facilities in those smaller schools, where the guys are a little bit more focused on the student athlete aspect instead of the business aspect. And I think it's critical for those small programs that they get a chance to play the Power 5 teams. So that's kind of my schedule of 8 conference games, 1 challenge week, 1 open P5 week, 1 G5 week, and 1 open non-Power 5 week.
Okay, so with the challenge week, I would enjoy that. I think college football would thrive with the challenge week. But under your description, the ACC plays the Big Ten. So the champions from the 2 conferences last year, Penn State and Clemson, play. I would be completely fine with that. I would just need to make sure that the other non-conference game would balance out the weight of that game, meaning Penn State's playing a team in Clemson that with 7-1, or under my plan would be playing 9 games. So let's say the champion went 8-1 last year. They would need to play a 1-8 team or a 2-7 team. I think in some cases you would need to give the leniency of a 1-game swing, but to balance that out so that Penn State, Clemson, the teams that finish at the top of each league are not playing too difficult of a schedule. I'm trying to equalize the scheduling.
But again, Mark, we can't make college football like the NFL exactly. And the reason the reason we can't do that is because if you're Florida and let's say you win the East this year, the SEC East, and next year your rotation is to play the Pac-12 North, and let's say Washington wins that, so now you're playing Washington, which is the number 1 team, and then so that means you won't be able to play Florida State, which is your historical rival. So if you have that if you mandate the composite 500, you're essentially getting rid of those inter-conference rivalries. Georgia Tech, Utah State. Well, that's G5 P5, but Georgia Tech, Florida State, Kentucky, Louisville. Those rivalries will have to go away because the mandated portions of the schedule will take force. So it's really a decision that the college football fan has to make. Do you want the schedule to be just like or as close to the NFL as possible, or do you want to keep that flexibility and maintain the interconference rivalries like the ones I just talked about? I would rather keep the flexibility and maintain those interconference rivalries.
So, Mike, I agree with your second point, but I think you misunderstand my first point. So I agree that the Florida State type out of conference games need to be continued. This would kind of hamper the scheduling and kind of hamstring the schedulers in one regard because they only have one other Power 5 game to play with, and that would have to balance out record-wise with what that other opponent did the previous year. But the NFL schedules to create parity, meaning that they take the teams that were the best teams from the previous season and they give them the most difficult schedules. They give the easier schedules to the lesser teams from the previous season. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to give equal schedules to everyone. I'm not giving the toughest schedules to Alabama and Ohio State and the easiest schedules to Purdue and Kansas. They're going to have the same non-conference scheduling.
Right, but so I understand what you're saying. So you're saying if Alabama played the number 1, so let's say Alabama wins the West this year, and next year their rotation's the Pac-12 South, and let's say USC won it this year. So if Alabama plays USC next year in Challenge Week 1, are you saying they would play the other P5 team that finished in the bottom of that division in the second challenge week, so that those two teams would equal out to about a 500 record from the previous season. Is that what you're saying?
That's correct.
So again, I don't think that would work because going back to my Florida example, if they win the East and they have to play, if they're mandated to play the Pac-12 North champion Washington, then they won't be able to play Florida State, which is their historical interconference rival. And okay. so it takes away those interconference rivalries if you mandate that 500 composite.
Okay. We first of all, we don't even need to think about who's winning what from the previous season. It doesn't even matter because everyone's going to play a 500 composite non-conference schedule from the season before. So it doesn't matter if you finish 7th or 1st or you're the champion of any kind of league. Alabama could play TCU, who went 5-4 in the Big 12, and they could play a 5-4 Utah team out of the Pac-12 because that's a 9-9 non-conference slate that Alabama would play, or anybody would play the next season. I want to equalize the scheduling. I don't want Baylor playing nobody and Florida playing Florida State and Michigan this year, for example.
Yeah, right. So you wouldn't have the number ones from divisions playing number ones the next season.
They could. They wouldn't have to.
I still think I think if you force, So you're saying you start with the rivals. You start with the rivals first, and then you build the schedule after that.
And the only thing I don't like about that is it forces them to most likely play a lesser team. So Florida playing Florida State each and every year, and Florida State typically being under your system an 8-game schedule, going 7-1, 6-2 every year, 8-0 in the conference. Florida's going to play another Power 5 that's near the bottom of the conference consistently. But that's what's going to make it fair and balanced and equitable across the board.
Right. So, but you're the most important thing for you is that composite 500 schedule. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
So you would have to start with the rivals first, unless you didn't want to keep the rivals, and then you would go from there. I actually think, and that's why I like the 1 week challenge week. So everybody plays the same, whatever division your division is paired up with that year, you play the team that finished in the same spot you finished in last year. So the SEC East third team will always play another conference's division's third team, and you'll just rotate. So we have 6 conferences, that's 12 divisions. So once every 11 years, you would play the team that finished in the same spot in your division the previous year. So every year you would play the same spot that you finished. You would just rotate through the other 11. And then that second week is free. And so if you have a rivalry game, you schedule that rival. If you don't, you're on your own to pick to schedule your team. And, if you're Purdue and you want to go out and try to find Maryland or Rutgers, that's fine. If you're Tennessee and you want to go out and try to find Oregon and Oklahoma, that's fine. And here's why it's fine, because we have 6 teams. And so the natural evolution of the playoffs, I think I'm a big fan of the 4-team playoff. But I will rarely acknowledge that if you have 6 conferences of 12 teams, that whole 4-team playoff thing is going to get very contentious when you have 2 conference champions who don't make it. So I'm willing to concede the 8-team playoff concept on if you institute this structure. But if you have 8 teams, so you have 6 conference champions. I mean, this is really easy. We cannot mess this up. You have 6 conference champions and you have 2 at-large bids. So the LSUs that schedule Wisconsin and Texas, they'll have a better shot at that at-large bid than the Purdues that schedule the Marylands and the Dukes.
Okay.
That's part of the inherent goodness of college football, is that it's just a little bit different from the NFL football, and that you can kind of have a little bit of debate room and wiggle room.
If this is there's still going to be debate because there's just not enough games played and there's too many teams to create any kind of overlapping schedule that can be compared that heavily. So there's always going to be a debate. If this system in any way is going to bring you into the fold for an 18 playoff, I'm all for it. The one issue I have, again, with the mandated challenge week that's slotted once you have the non-conference rivals is, let's just say in any given year, it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to say Florida State and Ohio State are the two best teams in the country. And if Florida's coming off a Eastern Division championship and they've got to play Florida State and the number one team in the Big Ten East, which let's say is Ohio State, then they've got by far the toughest non-conference schedule in the country.
Yeah, well, I mean that's what you get for being one of the top two toughest teams in the nation. You have to play tough competition. I'm okay with that. I acknowledge that could happen, and I'm okay with that.
Mike, actually, you're building the NFL schedule. I'm not. You're building the NFL schedule that slots teams and plays the tougher games against the better teams from the previous season.
Yeah, but that's only in challenge week 1. I don't have a challenge week 2. The second week is open for the team to schedule. So that's what makes my schedule not like the NFL schedule. And remember, even in the NFL, the number 1 team in the division gets the 1 and the 3, not the 1 and the 2, the 1 and the 3. And then the 2s and the 4s get the other 2s and 4s. 1s and 3s get 1s and 3s, and 2s and 4s get 2s and 4s.
So if you're one of the real heavyweights in college football and 4 out of every 5 years you're one of the 10 best teams in the country, and you know that every year you're going to be slated against one of the other best teams in the country because you're always going to finish first or second in your division, how do you think that program would go out and schedule that second Power 5 game?
It's up to them. I mean, if they want to really set themselves up for a possible at-large bid, they would schedule a decent to good team. If you think like Alabama or Ohio State and you think you're going to win your conference championship every year, maybe you schedule a lesser P5 team. But that's part of the school's responsibility to kind of strategize and to figure out how they want to do that scheduling.
So the other culmination of this scheduling genius that I've built here, Mike, is that right now college football is out of the news. The sports news revolves around the NBA, Major League Baseball, etc., and the NFL never seems to leave the landscape. There's always talk in the NFL. One of the most overhyped and overrated events, and I'll leave that term in quotes, is the release of the NFL schedule. Because I, as an NFL fan who understands how the NFL schedules, I can guess 12 or 13 out of the 16 games for every team because it's a formula schedule built on playing 2 teams in your division or playing everyone in your division twice, playing a rotating schedule against the other conference, and so forth. But they make a big deal about the schedule release in the NFL. I would make a big deal about the college football schedule release because no one would know what it was going to be other than knowing the rotation of the conferences. And I would have a big release date, May 1st, and we wouldn't constantly have these little bits of news coming out all the time that Georgia signed to play with Notre Dame in 2022 and 23. But we would have a schedule release on May 1st of college football and put college football in the spotlight for a few days.
Right. So correct me if I'm wrong, but an NFL fan at the end of the previous season, they know all 16 teams their team's going to play the next season, right? You play 2 full divisions, two of the 3 full divisions. You play the 2 and the 4 from the 3rd division that's not your division, the 3 teams in your division twice, and then all the teams from a rotating slate of divisions from the other conference. Isn't that how the NFL schedule works? Yeah. So, I mean, you know all 16 teams at the end of the season. You just don't know home and away, and you don't know the dates. That's really it for the NFL. So the one thing I would push back on your college schedule was who makes the schedule, because if that's going to be it, if you're going to have a schedule release, you're going to have a central authority that actually does the scheduling. You'll have to completely take the scheduling away from the schools. So who is that?
Well, right now we've got a selection committee that determines which teams are the 4 best in the country. Now, this is an easy thing that I just worked out in a couple of hours.
For 3 games, not 72 teams over a 12-game season. They do that for 3 games.
It's really not difficult. The conference scheduling is set. The conference is going to work on their own schedule. And then you allow each school to go out and schedule that FCS or group of 5, and you give them their open date in which they can do so. And then other than that, you match these teams up based on record.
Fair, fair. So is that the CFP committee or is that the NCAA writ large?
I think a committee of 12 people could work this out within a few months. They've got from the last day of the college football regular season, or the championship game weekend, all the way to May 1st to figure it out.
I do like that idea, the CFP schedule reveal. But I want to go back to one thing, that the 8-team playoff. There's a way to do a 4-team playoff with these 6 conferences.
There's a way to do a 2-team playoff. We've already seen that.
You take the 4 conferences that have the most success during the 2 challenge weeks, and the 4 conferences that have the most success during the challenge weeks, those are the 4 conference champions that get into the playoff. So you make that challenge week, you make those 2 challenge weeks the buy-ins for the college football playoffs.
Then there would be much controversy over which conferences play which conferences when. So while it rotates, let's say right now I would consider the SEC, the ACC, and the Big Ten to be the 3 best conferences. And if the ACC had to play the Big Ten and the SEC for its 2 challenge weeks, they might be a bit upset about that.
That's a fair point. But for those 14, for the 14 playoff proponents and hardcore 14 playoff 14 playoff fans, that's probably the only way you could save a 14 playoff in a 6x12 conference structure. I was just thinking, I was actually thinking, how do I save the 14 playoff? That was the only thing I came up with.
I don't know why you would want to save it, Mike.
Because it's 2 extra games instead of 3 extra games. So here's a question for you: 8-team playoff. Would you play the first round a week or 2 after championship week, so that the losers get a chance to play in late season bowls, get a second bowl game, or no?
Are you talking about first round playoff losers would play again?
Yeah. So if you play the first round of the playoffs, maybe a week or 2 after championship week, the losers can still play in a second bowl, because then what you have is you have a conference champion who gets to play 1 bowl game if they lose that first round, which is the same number as everybody else. But then the other 4 teams will play 2 or 3 bowl games instead.
Do you think any team, I'll fill in the blank with LSU, wants to turn around 2 weeks after losing a college football playoff game and wants to prepare for a bowl game that they really would think was meaningless?
Yeah, that's a good point. But the other issue is you have to play that first game. You have to play the first round a week mid-December anyway, because you still have 2 more games to go for the winners. So really I guess the first round serves as really the kickoff to bowl week. So you have big games, and then you have your New Mexico bowls and your Poinsettia bowls, and then you get back into the big bowls. I guess that's how that would work under this system.
Mike, I was able at one point to work out the college football schedule the same as it is right now through championship weekend, give everyone a week off, and have a 16-team playoff that would end at the same time as the college football championship game does now.
I'm not buying the 16-team playoff. I'm not doing it.
Well, that includes the group of 5.
If you're going to have a 16-team playoff, I mean that's more a 4. That's more teams? That's the same number. That's more teams in the NFL playoffs. They have 6, so 12. They have 12 teams total. So that's more teams in the NFL.
Yeah, 12 out of 32.
12 out of 32
instead of 16 out of 128.
Yeah, well, 16 out of 72.
Okay,
you can't count the G5 here.
Well, you bring me to the last bit of ground we're going to cover, so you don't include the group of 5 into your championship series, the playoff.
I don't think you can. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons to go to a 6x12 structure, so that you can kind of make the championship tier and the second tier.
Or you can include, with an 18 playoff, you can include 6 winners, 1 wild card, and then you give the group of 5 champion or best team or number 1 seed, which would have played a Power 5 team, entry into the playoff.
Yeah, so I'm not going that way. I mean, we have 64 Power 5 teams now, so we're adding 8. We're basically pulling up 8 teams from G5. And I think if you structure a 6x12, you make the conscious decision to pull up the 8 best teams from the G5. And so when a G5 team demonstrates that they're clearly the best team in the landscape, it's kind of like the NCAA basketball tournament. Don't tell me that we need to expand the tournament until a 16 beats a 1. And when a 16 beats a 1, I'll start listening to the argument that we need to expand the tournament. But until then, it doesn't need to be expanded. When a G5 team wins the national championship or is clearly the best team in the nation, then I'll start, I think then that argument gains legitimacy. Until then, we've already pulled up 8 teams from the G5. We're pulling up BYU. We're pulling up Boise. I'm pulling up Colorado State. You're pulling up Temple. We both have Navy. I think we're both pulling up. I'm pulling up Houston. You're pulling up Connecticut. So we're leaving. So we're pulling 8 guys up from those G5 anyway. I don't think any of the 56 has a legitimate claim to be in the college football playoffs. Certainly not more than either Michigan or Ohio State, whichever one doesn't win the Big Ten East, or Alabama, LSU, whichever one doesn't win the SEC West, or USC, or maybe Colorado or UCLA if they're having a good season. So whoever doesn't win the Pac-12 South. I think 2 at-large bids is probably the minimum I would have.
No, I was just talking out loud. I completely agree. And to extend to your point, to give an entry to a team that played a complete
G5 schedule.
Excluding one game, they played 11 other games against teams that had no competition with the teams that we are. Yeah, to create this vacuum and then bring one team in would make absolute no sense.
I mean, Houston this year is a great example. They start out, they get their one shot with Oklahoma. They beat Oklahoma, and then they go and they lose. Then they lose to then they had a shot against Louisville. They lost to Louisville, but they also lost to Navy. So if they had not scheduled Louisville and they just had that one shot against Oklahoma, they win that. But clearly they weren't able to sustain that level of performance and success throughout the whole season.
What's funny, Mike, is Houston actually won that game against Louisville late in the season on a Thursday night. So they won the 2 games that everyone targeted. They lost 3 other games.
Yeah, that's right. That's why I was so confused when I said that.
In Memphis and somebody else.
Yeah, Memphis. That was the one I was trying to think of. Yeah, so but the point is, and they looked really good against Louisville. They crushed Louisville, but then they go out and they lose to Memphis and Navy as well, and one other team. So that's the whole thing that fans of the SEC always talk about is maintaining that high level performance throughout the whole season against a tougher conference. And that's the value of the conference. And I think the way we've restructured it here with the 6x12, we really kind of built that into it. So again, I don't think we really should entertain the G5 bid into the playoffs under our constructs.
Well, I think we've proven 2 things. One is that it can get better. Number 2 is that there is no perfect system, and anybody who thinks that they have one, start to work with the logistics, and you start to bring from one and then you pull from another, and then you figure out, oh, I separated those 2 and they should be in the same conference. It's a pretty difficult task to take. All right, Mike LaValle from Last Word on College Football. Do you have a parting shot, Mike?
No, always a great discussion, and hopefully one of us will be in charge of college football one day so we can implement this 6x12 system. I really like it.
Well, it most likely would be you, Mike. You would just need to leave your Twitter direct messaging and your email open to me at all times.
Right. Well, it already is, and it always will be.